A man believed that his blood was turning into powder, and the only cure that could fix it was to murder and drink the blood of other humans, including children. What followed was a horrifying reign of terror so gruesome that it shocked the entire nation. Today, we're going to be talking about the true story of the Sacramento vampire himself, Richard Chase. This case is extremely graphic and disturbing, so viewers, please be warned and proceed with caution. It was a chilly Monday afternoon in Sacramento, California. On January 23, 1978, 22-year-old and pregnant Teresa Wallen was home alone while her husband David was at work. Teresa was a soft-spoken and gentle woman, and she had just married the love of her life, David, only 1 year earlier. The Wallens were so excited to bring their first child into the family, and nobody could have imagined what horror was about to destroy them. Teresa and David lived in a cozy single-story home, and on that day, Teresa had just ran a few errands. She returned home from the store just around noon, and she came in carrying a few bags, then stepped outside to take the trash out. But Teresa left her front door unlocked, and a man had been watching Teresa ever since she got back home. That man was Richard Trenton Chase, also known as the Sacramento vampire. What he actually turned out to be was way more disturbing than a vampire, though. That day, Chase had been wandering the neighborhood looking for an unlocked door. In Richard Chase's delusional mind, an open door gave him the green light to enter. He later told investigators that he believed locked doors meant he wasn't welcome, but an unlocked door granted him permission to enter the home, which is also very vampire-y if you kind of think about it. That was all the justification that he needed to commit the crimes that he did. Has anyone else noticed that this is sort of a trend? I remember watching the documentary on Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and he said the exact same thing. But before we get too far in, welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse that loves all things nursing and true crime. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below any case suggestions that you have, and I will be sure to take a look into them. We have lots of new friends here now, so for those of you that are new, we assess cases in what's called nursing SBAR format, which is a way that nurses actually give report to one another. So it's sort of unique in the true crime space, and it changes the order of traditional storytelling. Also, yes, I do cover all things true crime, not just nursing, but I am going to share my expertise that I do have at any points that I can. All right, everybody, back to the story. Now, I need to give you all a trigger warning because this is about to get very disturbing and difficult to hear. Please forgive me in advance if I get emotional because this is really difficult to talk about. Dressed in a red-orange ski parka and carrying a .22 caliber handgun, Chase approached the Wallen home and quietly slipped inside. Teresa was just returning to the living room from taking out the trash when she saw him and was immediately struck with fear. Chase raised the gun and fired at her. The first shot struck her in the palm as she raised her hand in a defensive motion. The second grazed her shoulder and jaw, and the third shot hit her square in the temple on her head. An injury in this location, despite how it's depicted in the movies, is not always fatal. I have worked in trauma before as a registered nurse, and you would actually be surprised how many head gunshot wounds are survivable. It's all about what portion of the brain has been impacted by that shot. She then fell to the ground, bleeding profusely, but Chase wasn't done just yet. He dragged her body into the bedroom where he began a ritual of pure terror. Using a butcher knife that he found in the kitchen, he slit her abdomen open from the sternum, which is on the chest, down to her pelvis, exposing her muscles and her vital organs. He removed several of her organs, placing them on the bedspread like trophies. He stabbed her multiple times in the liver, then the lungs and kidneys. Blood pooled on the carpet beneath her as both the life of her and her baby slipped away. This is a whole other ballpark of torture because what most people don't know or don't think about is she may have remained conscious during parts of this brutal attack, depending on, again, the location of the gunshot that I mentioned earlier. I want you to think about something terrifying to put yourself in her shoes. We know that invasive surgeries are done under general anesthesia, so fully put to sleep, right? What most people don't always think of, though, is that we do this to put you in a restful state to keep you still and free of pain during an operation or procedure. To know that she may have still been alert Feeling this type of pain, especially as an empath, makes me too sick to my stomach to even articulate. He then performed an act so grotesque that homicide detectives had difficulty speaking about it later. He inserted feces from her dog into her mouth and smeared it across her face. He used yogurt containers from her trash to scoop up and drink her blood. He then did another horrendous act to her body, post-mortem, sexually violating her corpse before finally fleeing the scene. When her husband returned home around 6 p.m., he stepped into his worst nightmare. Blood streaked the walls and the floors, and his wife's body was naked, mutilated, and disfigured laying in the bedroom. David reported that the room smelled of blood, feces, and death. Teresa's wedding ring had been removed, and her internal organs were all exposed. Her killer had not taken any money, jewelry, or valuables, only her life and her blood. His entire world came crashing down in an instant. He had just lost literally everything. The crime scene was immediately identified by police as unusual and far from anything they'd ever seen before, but there were signs of ritualism, rage, and a lack of planning. Nothing was taken, and there was no attempt to cover up the crime. Investigators began to suspect that this was the act of a severely disturbed individual, and they definitely got that right. But the brutality, especially the removal of the organs and evidence of possible cannibalism, made the case particularly horrifying. Forensic investigators collected bloody footprints, fingerprints, and several shell casings at the scene. The caliber matched an unsolved shooting from weeks earlier, the death of 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin. More to come on that later, though. Worse was yet to come, though. So much worse. Just 4 days after the murder of Teresa Wallen, Richard Chase struck again on January 27, 1978, and this time his violence reached an unimaginable level. Evelyn Morath was a 38-year-old single mother of 2, and Evelyn was well-liked in the neighborhood, and she was described as kind, warm, and always willing to help friends in need. On this particular Friday morning, Evelyn was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira. Her 6-year-old son, Jason, was also home from school that day because he had had a cold. Her friend, Dan Meredith, 51, had stopped by to help take her and the kids to a doctor's appointment. Chase walked through the neighborhood in broad daylight. He looked unkempt, pale, and he had sunken cheeks and wild, darting eyes. He carried his .22 caliber handgun and a knife this time, hidden in his coat. He hadn't bathed in days, and the overpowering stench of blood and rot still clung to his clothes from the Wallen murder. Again, he checked door after door through the neighborhood, all locked until he came to the Morath residence that Friday morning. Inside, Dan Meredith was near the front hallway. He saw Chase and froze. Chase shot him in the head, point blank, killing him instantly. Chase then stole Dan's car keys and left the body lifeless in the hallway until he realized other people were home. Evelyn was in the bathroom, stepping out of the shower when she heard the shot and rushed out, likely trying to get to her children to protect them. Chase then shot her in the head, killing her instantly. He then dragged her body to the bed to begin yet another horrifying ritual. Jason, at 6 years old, had just witnessed the most traumatic event of his life. I cannot imagine the fear he must have felt in this moment, seeing the 2 adults present be killed that were there to protect him. As soon as Chase caught eyes with Jason, he shot him twice in the head. His body was later found in his bedroom, still in his pajamas, and his wounds indicated to the investigators that he did not even attempt to run. This precious boy was still frozen in fear. Chase returned to Evelyn's body, and what he did next followed his sadistic, alarming pattern that he had prior. He mutilated her corpse with his knife, opening her abdomen and removing organs just like Teresa. He collected her blood in a bucket and drank it. He then engaged in necrophilia with her body, repeatedly violating her after she had died. A blood-stained rubber spatula and broken glass bottle were found nearby, indicating that he had used foreign objects on her as well. In a final, horrifying act, Chase took the last person in the home, 22-month-old David Ferreira. The child was abducted, and his tiny body was wrapped in a blanket and taken from the home. Chase placed David in Dan Meredith's car and drove back to his apartment, where the horrifying acts continued. I know I keep using that word, but it truly is. There, over the course of several hours, Richard Chase dismembered the baby. He decapitated David, consumed parts of his organs, and discarded the remains in a cardboard box. 2 days later, the baby's body was discovered near a church, thrown away like garbage. His decapitated head was found wrapped in a plastic bag with even more signs of post-mortem mutilation. The scene at the Maroth home was a literal nightmare. Responding officers were stunned, as anyone with a soul would be. Blood was everywhere, and fingerprints, which we now know are Chase's, were left in nearly every room in the home. Shell casings matched the .22 caliber handgun that was also used in the Griffin and Wallen murders, and footprints smeared in blood connected rooms in a frantic path. The sheer brutality and ritualistic nature of these killings led police to conclude that they were dealing with a serial killer, someone not just committing murder, but committing murder with symbolic or psychological purposes. FBI profilers were contacted immediately. Robert Ressler, one of the founding members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, would later say that this case was one of the most grotesque he had ever studied in his career, and I can fully understand why. The entire community was struck with fear and panic. Who could commit these crimes? The dream of having neighborhoods safe enough to leave doors unlocked was long gone. The media was in a frenzy. Police had a break in the case, and that came from a woman named Nancy Holden. She had run into Richard Chase while shopping just a couple of days prior. She actually went to high school with him, and she recognized him despite his ragged appearance and odd behavior. Richard Chase approached her and asked if she remembered him. Then he rambled on about strange conspiracies and a car accident that she had been in years prior, and Nancy found his behavior disturbing. So after hearing about the Maroth family murders and the Wallen family murders, she then called the police. She told them about Richard Chase because his odd statements and his appearance and everything just made her feel very uneasy. I wonder how much of this feeling was just her gut intuition screaming at her. But detectives immediately looked into him because they couldn't risk losing any opportunity to get to the bottom of who killed these people, and in this manner. A background check revealed that Richard Chase had a criminal record. He also had a registered .22 caliber handgun, and this put the investigators officially on his trail. Armed with Nancy Holden's tip and Chase's address, police began surveillance on his apartment at 2931 Watt Avenue. The building was a small, rundown complex with only a few tenants living there. Neighbors complained frequently about foul smells and odd noises coming from Chase's unit. Some claimed to see him pacing naked, windows wide open, and rambling to himself often. These would be immediate red flags to me for mental illness, but detectives decided to make their move on January 27, 1978, the same day as the Maroth murders. When Chase left his apartment carrying a blood-soaked box, police tackled him and arrested him on site. Inside the box were rags, clothing, and newspapers soaked in human blood. On him, they found Dan Meredith's wallet and car keys and his ski parka that was already stained with the dried blood. They immediately secured a search warrant and entered the apartment. What they found was truly unbelievable. Inside the vampire's lair, or Chase's apartment, it was a massive biohazard zone. The smell hit investigators before the door had even opened, and it was a foul mixture of rot, blood, feces, and decay, similar to the crime scenes. Every single surface in that apartment was coated in blood. The floor was sticky with it, and blood covered the kitchen counters, the bathroom sink, the refrigerator, even the walls and ceiling. In the kitchen, they found tools for his rituals: a blood-stained blender filled with tissue and coagulated blood, knives caked in matter, stained drinking glasses, and pots that were crusted with internal organs. Human organs, including Evelyn Maroth's liver and Teresa Wallen's kidneys, were found wrapped in foil inside the freezer. A baby's brain, which turned out to be David's, was also discovered in a Tupperware container. Chase had preserved parts of his victims, likely for consumption at a later time. The refrigerator had several cans of animal food, rotten meat, and cartons of bloodied milk. The walls were adorned with strange symbols scribbled in blood, and I cannot show images of the scene on YouTube, but you guys, if you do a search for yourselves, the images are shocking to say the least. On a calendar near his bed, several future dates were marked with the word today, meaning he was likely planning more murders. Chase was formally charged with 6 counts of murder. So, based on what we currently know, do you think that these were his first crimes, or do you think he killed before? What could possibly drive someone to not only commit these types of crimes, but also live in this manner? Pause and let me know your thoughts down below in the comments before we find out. To understand the nightmare that Richard Chase unleashed on Sacramento, we need to take a look inside his mind and background. Chase's terror didn't begin with murder. It began with whispers of unfamiliar, scary voices, invisible poisons, and the belief that his own body had been betraying him. Born on May 23, 1950, Richard Trenton Chase seemed to be your average little boy, but home life was anything but stable for him growing up. Raised in Sacramento, Chase was the son of a very strict, controlling father and a cold, emotionally distant mother, and this is a recipe for disaster when it comes to mental health, but not everyone turns out this way. His parents' marriage was rocky, with tons of arguments, emotional abuse, and neglect happening between the two of them and the kids. They eventually got a divorce, and custody was split between his parents, which started the back and forth between homes. Richard and his sister suffered deeply because of the dysfunction between his parents, and Richard reportedly received beatings for even the smallest of mistakes from his parents. Even as a child, Chase showed signs that something was wrong, something we see often in the true crime space. But the first behavior that his parents felt could be off was that he was a chronic bedwetter until his early teens. This was obviously concerning to them, but there were other signs that raised even more clear red flags. He set small fires, often despite punishment, and he tortured small animals, including cats and birds. These behaviors are what psychologists refer to as the McDonald triad, and this is a cluster of childhood behaviors that are often linked to future violent tendencies. Despite the signs, though, Chase functioned well enough to get through elementary and middle school without any trouble or punishment. Teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn during those years. He didn't seem to have any close friendships, and there were no clear outward signs of the horror that would later come, according to the school staff at least. But inside, something was brewing. As he entered his teen years, Chase became increasingly isolated. His self-esteem was low, and he reported that he struggled with significant sexual dysfunction, later claiming that he was unable to maintain erections, which is obviously abnormal for a teenager. Doctors found no physical reason for that problem, though. Because there was no answer, this heightened Chase's paranoia about his own body. He became convinced that his body was failing him and that his organs were moving around, his blood was vanishing, and his heart was literally shrinking. Obviously, we know that these thoughts aren't true, but something that I need to say is that for anyone struggling with mental health disorders, their thoughts and their feelings are very real to them, and that's why early intervention is extremely important. This is heavily taught in nursing because we need to understand the full spectrum of a person, including their mental health, in order to properly care for them. At this point, Richard Chase began experimenting with drugs, primarily marijuana and LSD, in an attempt to escape his growing anxiety and physical fears. This is very common for those struggling with mental health disorders. Rather than helping him, though, these substances seem to amplify his delusions and just set a blaze to his mental health. By age 18, he was experiencing frequent bouts of hypochondria. He would visit doctors and ERs complaining that someone had, quote, stolen his pulmonary artery or that his stomach was rotting from the inside. Physicians would dismiss these complaints as psychosomatic, meaning he's convincing himself that these things are happening and he's now experiencing real symptoms from that thought. He was sent home again and again with no diagnosis. And this is really frustrating for me to hear because had the hospital provided him resources and gotten him help, then these tragedies may not have happened. Psychiatric evaluations happen every day at the hospital whenever there's a clear indication for it. So why wasn't that done for Chase? By the time he reached his early 20s, though, Chase's behavior became more and more bizarre and erratic. He was frequently paranoid, and he believed that people, including his own mother, were plotting against him. He would barricade himself inside his room, nail furniture to the door, and accuse family members of trying to, quote, steal his organs. He thought that his skull bones were separating and moving, and he believed his blood was literally turning to dust. These alarming thoughts then transitioned to a new focus, and he began to obsess over the one thing he thought might save him: blood. In 1973, Chase's family reached a breaking point with his behavior. Again, this is a very common finding for families living with someone that is suffering from these symptoms. After several incidents, including one in which Richard injected himself with rabbit blood and became extremely sick, they had him hospitalized at American River Hospital Psychiatric Ward. There, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and determined to be gravely disabled. Doctors at the facility documented some disturbing behaviors. Chase would capture birds from the courtyard, snap their necks, and drink their blood. He smeared blood on the walls of his room. He refused to eat hospital food, claiming that it was poisoned, and at one point, he insisted that soap dishes in his room were releasing toxic gas into the air. Despite all of this, after a short period of treatment with the antipsychotic meds, Chase was considered stable and discharged. But was he stable enough for discharge? His mother, Beatrice, had been granted legal conservatorship over him, but she rejected the doctor's recommendations to keep Chase on the antipsychotics. She believed that they made him, quote, zombie-like, and insisted that she could manage him without them. Beatrice moved him into his own apartment and then completely withdrew from caring for him. So the only chance that Richard Chase had at managing his schizophrenia was taken from him, and then he was put into his own apartment by himself. This was a fatal mistake. Chase's apartment became a dark sanctum of blood, obsession, and paranoia. The apartment was filthy. Neighbors reported rotten odors, loud music at all hours through the night, and occasional sightings of Chase walking naked, not only in his apartment, but also in the hallways. He rarely bathed, and his hair grew long and matted, and Chase became skeletal, surviving on a diet of Coca-Cola, raw meat, and animal organs. He began purchasing rabbits from a local breeder, and he would then take them home, kill them, and drink their blood. Sometimes he boiled the remains, and other times he ate them raw. Sadly, he did the same thing with neighborhood pets. Flyers for missing dogs and cats piled up in the surrounding areas, many of which were traced back to Chase. His obsession with blood had grown into full-blown psychosis. He wasn't trying to harm others, at least not yet, but he believed he was curing himself through his actions, and he believed that if he didn't drink that blood, he would die. But soon, animals were no longer enough to sustain him. By late 1977, Richard Chase's delusions had escalated to an even more dangerous level. His floor was covered in newspapers soaked in blood, and his body had withered to a mere 145 pounds, gaunt and hollow-eyed. And now he was convinced that only human blood could save him. He had reached what psychiatrists later referred to as, quote, the breaking point, the moment when delusion transforms into action and when thoughts and obsession transition to violence. On the night of December 29, 1977, Richard would kill a human for the first time. Ambrose Griffin was a 51-year-old father of two and a man that was dearly loved. He was a retired engineer and Korean War veteran and was known in his East Sacramento neighborhood for his calm demeanor and helpful nature. That night, he was helping his wife carry groceries from the car into their home on Tioga Way, which is the same street that the other victims were attacked as well. It was around 9 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet. Children were inside, tucked away in their beds, and the lights from the Christmas decorations still flickered, when suddenly a shot rang out. Ambrose fell to the ground. At first, his wife thought that he tripped or suffered a heart attack, but then she saw the blood. He had been shot in the chest, and she panicked and didn't know what to do, so she screamed for help, which neighbors luckily heard and immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived quickly, but despite their best efforts, it had been too late. The bullet had torn through his heart, and this injury was not survivable. Ambrose Griffin was pronounced dead at the scene. Sadly, there were no witnesses who had seen a shooter, but a few neighbors said that they heard a car backfiring just moments before the tragedy, even though no one had seen anyone fleeing the area. There was no motive, No enemy, no theft, just a single fatal gunshot and an innocent man senselessly left for dead. Investigators initially believed that the shooting had to have been a random drive-by because this attack just didn't make any sense. So, was it maybe a gang initiation or something? But they canvassed the neighborhood and found reports of an old orange station wagon driving erratically nearby, but no one was able to get down the license plate for police to track. What no one knew yet was that Richard Chase had been driving that car. He had fired from the vehicle while slowly prowling through the neighborhood, looking for a random target, someone that he could shoot to, quote, test his gun and his theory about blood. In his later confession, Chase told investigators that he didn't know Ambrose. He picked him because he, quote, looked weak and would go down easy. The killing was, in his mind, a practice run and an easy target. The murder of Ambrose Griffin did something overwhelming to Chase, though. It thrilled him, and for the first time, he felt a sense of control in his life. But something, according to Richard Chase, was still missing. He hadn't gotten quite close enough to his victim, and he hadn't touched the blood, and he hadn't tasted it. He needed more. Chase began hunting for his next victim in a different way. He wanted to see the blood, feel it, and consume it. He wanted to be inside the scene, so he began walking door to door, testing doorknobs and peeking through windows and hunting for that one unlocked door. In early January of 1978, investigators continued to search for the person responsible for Ambrose Griffin's murder, but they had no suspects. The bullet casings were bagged, and a canvass of nearby homes provided them no leads. Meanwhile, Richard Chase returned to his apartment, reloaded his .22, and waited. His fantasies were intensifying, and his rituals with animal blood no longer satisfied him. He started to plan what he called, quote, a blood fix, which would be a direct infusion of human blood and organs to him. During this time, he had convinced himself that he was being hunted by Nazis, that aliens were watching him through the windows, and that his internal organs were literally turning to dust. He believed that if he didn't consume blood regularly, he would die. This led to the horrendous events that took place that we discussed at the beginning. Sacramento Police Department faced one of the most disturbing crime sprees in the city's history. What had started as a mysterious shooting with a random killing of Ambrose Griffin had escalated into the grotesque murders of Teresa Wallen and the Maroth family. 6 people were dead. 2 children had been executed, and a baby had been abducted, decapitated, and cannibalized. There were no signs of robbery, still no motives, and no clear connections between the victims. Only one thing was clear. Sacramento had a serial killer, and he was spiraling out of control. The breakthrough came when investigators analyzed the .22 caliber shell casings recovered from all 3 crime scenes. The casings were consistent in make, brand, and firing patterns. Ballistics matched them to the same firearm, which was a semi-automatic .22 caliber pistol, meaning that it was now undeniable. These were not isolated murders. All of these crimes were the work of one man. Fingerprints found at the Wallen and Maroth homes were lifted and run through local databases, but initially came up with no matches. Investigators may not have had a known suspect just yet, but they did have patterns. They knew the killer entered through unlocked doors, struck quickly, and exhibited signs of extreme mental illness, necrophilia, cannibalism, and compulsive blood consumption. Police requested from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit one of the earliest uses of criminal profiling in a serial murder case. FBI profiler Robert Ressler, who had studied some of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history, was assigned to the case. He examined the crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and behavioral clues from the witness accounts. His findings were alarming. Ressler described the perpetrator as a disorganized killer, someone who likely suffered from acute mental illness, meaning it's happening now, possibly paranoid schizophrenia. Disorganized killers, unlike methodical or organized murderers, act impulsively. They don't plan, they leave messy crime scenes, and they usually don't cover their tracks. They choose victims totally at random, kill quickly, and flee in confusion or exhilaration. They tend to live alone, appear socially awkward, and may have a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. Ressler predicted that the suspect would live nearby, was in his mid-20s to 30s, likely had a criminal record or history of mental illness, might exhibit strange behaviors in public like talking to himself, poor hygiene, or paranoia, and was not killing for money or revenge, but instead to satisfy a psychological need. This blew my mind to see how accurate Ressler's profile actually was. It was spot on. As we know from the beginning, thanks to Nancy's call and FBI profile and the forensic work with the bullets, they honed in on Richard Chase and he was arrested and charged. When Richard Trenton Chase was arrested on January 27, 1978, Sacramento law enforcement believed that the worst was over because the bloodshed had finally stopped. The man that they believed was responsible for 6 horrifying murders, a killer who drank blood, mutilated corpses, and cannibalized a baby, was finally behind bars. But the criminal justice system had to determine why he did it and decide if he was fit to stand trial. On March 24, 1978, Richard Chase was formally indicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder for Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Dan Meredith, Evelyn Maroth, 6-year-old Jason Maroth, and 22-month-old David Ferreira. Prosecutors announced that they would be seeking the death penalty due to the extraordinary brutality of the crimes, the murder of the child, and the serial nature of these killings. Sacramento Deputy District Attorney Ronald Reagan, not the president, led the prosecution. His case relied on overwhelming forensic evidence, including the murder weapon, the .22 caliber handgun registered to Chase, ballistics matching all 6 crimes, Chase's fingerprints and footprints at multiple scenes, bloodstains and organs recovered from his apartment, the victim's wallet in his possession, and his own bizarre confessions and behavior. But Reagan knew the greatest hurdle wouldn't be proving Chase committed these murders. That part was crystal clear. The real hurdle was going to be convincing the jury that Chase was sane when he committed them. Richard Chase's public defender, Ferris Salami, faced an uphill battle. Chase had confessed to drinking blood, removing organs, believing that his heart had stopped, and claiming that he needed their blood to live. He spoke about UFOs, soap dish poisoning, and, quote, blood powder in his stomach, but Salami's team argued that Chase was not guilty by reason of insanity. They presented decades of psychiatric evidence, including, first thing, multiple involuntary hospitalizations, meaning he was forced to go, the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, having documented hallucinations, delusions, and Chase's inability to understand that his actions were wrong. Psychiatrists who had examined Chase in jail testified that he was completely disconnected from reality. He believed his crimes were part of a survival mechanism, not that he did anything harmful or illegal. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to, quote, fix himself. In his delusional mind, he needed human blood to prevent his internal organs from turning into powder. One psychiatrist explained how Chase believed a foreign force was manipulating him through microwaves at home. He also believed that his blood had been replaced with battery acid and that he had to replenish it by drinking fresh blood, saying, quote, preferably human, but animal if necessary, end quote. That Chase never tried to hide his crimes. He left blood and evidence everywhere, and he didn't flee. He didn't destroy the murder weapon, and he didn't even lock his apartment. These were not the actions of a calculated killer, but instead of a man that's fully out of touch with reality. Chase's obsession with blood wasn't from a vampire fantasy like the public believed. There was also no evidence that he believed he even was a vampire. He refused to eat jail food unless it was sealed and sometimes demanded that the guards tasted it first. Despite the overwhelming psychiatric evidence of psychosis, Chase could be deemed legally sane somehow? Can someone so deeply delusional and mentally ill be held responsible for murder? Let me know how you feel in the comments about this, because I know that this is going to be a very polarizing topic, but I think we can have some good discussion on it. Psychiatrists, however, describe Chase as one of the most psychotic individuals he has ever studied. He was incapable of empathy, completely isolated from reality, and consumed by an internal battle between fantasy and reality. Some experts questioned whether prison or even death row was the right place for him, or if he actually needed a permanent psychiatric hospitalization. The prosecution countered with its own mental health experts who acknowledged Chase's schizophrenia, but instead, they still insisted he was legally sane. Their core argument was that Richard Chase knew that what he was doing was wrong. They pointed to specific actions that demonstrated some sense of self-awareness by pointing out that he wore gloves at one crime scene, suggesting that it may have been an attempt to hide his fingerprints. He also used different doors to enter and exit homes, and he abducted baby David and disposed of the body days later in a separate location to hide evidence. And he also fled scenes quickly and didn't return to them. Prosecutors emphasized that mental illness does not equal legal insanity. To be declared not guilty by reason of insanity in California, a defendant had to either not understand the nature of his act or not understand that it was wrong. The prosecution's experts argued that while Chase was deeply disturbed, he understood that he was committing crimes, and he took steps to avoid getting caught. Maybe not all of the steps, but he did take some of them. Chase appeared in court each day wearing baggy clothes with an eerie, calm expression. He rarely spoke unless prompted, and at times he would whisper to his attorney about, quote, poison in the walls, or ask the judge if he could, quote, see his blood leaking out. Courtroom observers said that he seemed disconnected, almost like a sleepwalker, yet Chase never once denied committing any of the crimes. Instead, he appeared either indifferent or deeply lost in his own delusional world. Several times, he disrupted proceedings by making bizarre requests. First, he demanded a Jewish attorney because he believed Jews were the only ones not plotting against him. Then he asked the judge if he could, quote, get blood transfusions in court. He also tried to pass a note to the bailiff warning them that, quote, people in this room are aliens. Despite these outbursts, the judge ruled that Chase was competent to stand trial. On May 8, 1979, after only 5 hours of deliberating, the jury returned a verdict. Richard Chase had been found guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. One juror later explained to the media, quote, we knew he was sick, but we also knew that he knew what he was doing. 2 days later, during the penalty phase, the jury voted unanimously for the death penalty, and the judge formally sentenced Richard Chase to die in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison in California. The courtroom was silent. The families of the victims cried, and they were very emotional, not in celebration, but in relief. The families felt that justice was finally being served, but for many, it didn't bring peace. By the time Chase was sentenced to death, the nation had already labeled him a monster. But behind the infamous nickname, quote, the Vampire of Sacramento, unquote, was a man whose mind was completely and utterly broken. Chase became a huge case study for the FBI, which is common for them to do in order to sharpen their skills moving forward. But Ressler, the FBI agent, visited Chase at San Quentin State Prison shortly after his conviction. He was actually shocked by Chase's appearance. He was pale, emaciated, and he looked so much more like a psychiatric patient than a cold-blooded killer to him now. His fangs had suddenly dissipated. Chase was hunched over, mumbling to himself with long fingernails and wild eyes. Only those of us that have assessed or seen it firsthand know what that truly looks like, but there's a void that is unlike anything else in the eyes of someone that's experiencing psychosis. Chase didn't respond to his name at first, and oftentimes he was staring at corners of the room as if someone invisible were there with them. When Ressler finally got him talking, the floodgates opened. Chase began rambling about bizarre conspiracies. He was claiming that he was being persecuted by various beings who were using microwaves to continue poisoning him. He still believed his stomach had been turned inside out and that his heart was still shrinking. He also continued to believe that his blood was turning into powdered bleach. He didn't speak about his crimes with pride or shame. He was just emotionally detached. He told Ressler that drinking blood kept him alive and that eating raw organs restored his energy. When asked why he mutilated the victims, Chase said, quote, I had to get the poison out of them. This image of Richard Chase shifting from horrific monster to someone ill was truly unexpected by the FBI agent. Despite the police reassurance, The community continued to hold forums and church meetings in nearly every neighborhood in Sacramento. People demanded answers, not only about the crimes, but about the system that had failed to catch him sooner and the mental health institutions that had released him preliminarily. Residents in the Arden Arcade area, where the Wallen and Maroth families had lived, began installing steel security doors, and realtors reported that houses on those same streets saw a huge dip in value almost overnight because everyone was terrified of living there. Chase became an object of public obsession. Local talk radios aired call-ins with all kinds of theories and even claims of Chase sightings long after he had been in custody. Some wondered if he had accomplices, and many others were worried about copycat killers. Rumors swirled that Chase had, quote, ritual books or belonged to some local evil cult, which both were untrue. Despite all of the community chatter, one rumor was very real, that he had been in and out of psychiatric care and that his mother had removed him from treatment. That detail ignited public outrage, and in my opinion, rightfully so. As we have already touched on, the nickname the Vampire of Sacramento did not come from the police or not even from the psychiatrists. It came from the media. Journalists competing for that front page slot used that phrase to boost headlines. Vampire implied not just horror, but a myth, almost supernatural evil, something more monstrous than even a human. While it did grab attention, it also distorted the truth. Richard Chase didn't kill because he believed he was a vampire. He didn't follow folklore or any dark rituals, and he didn't wear a black cape or drink blood for pleasure. The compulsion that he did have was to consume blood out of delusion, not fantasy. After being sentenced to death in May of 1979, Richard Trenton Chase was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, California's oldest and most notorious correctional facility, like we touched on earlier. It was here that he would spend his final 18 months of life, and yes, I meant to say 18 months. He was not in a padded room or psychiatric ward, but in a death row cell, A206, surrounded by some of the state's most dangerous and violent men. But Chase stood out from the rest, not because of his crimes, as horrific as they were, but for his fragile appearance, his delusional murmurs, and the deep sense among the guards and inmates that he didn't belong there. They all agreed that he was severely mentally ill. When Chase arrived at San Quentin in the summer of 1979, he weighed just over 140 pounds, and he looked pale, gaunt, and jittery like before. He rarely made eye contact with anyone, and he refused to eat for days at a time, claiming that his food was poisoned. At other times, he gorged himself on prison meals only to vomit them back up later, convinced that the guards had contaminated his blood through mashed potatoes. Richard Chase spent hours pacing his cell, sometimes singing softly, other times shouting random phrases to anyone that could hear him. He wrote cryptic letters to the judge who sentenced him, demanding medical treatment for, quote, a stolen stomach, or requesting legal action against the people melting his brain with microwave beams. Chase also developed an obsession with toxic substances, or maybe they continued. He continued to hoard his feces and urine in small containers just like he had in the apartment, claiming he needed to test them for evidence of chemical attacks. He begged guards for vials, test strips, and even syringes, all of which were, of course, denied. Other death row inmates quickly became aware of Chase's deteriorating condition, though. Some mocked him, others ignored him completely, but in the prison hierarchy of killers, Chase was seen as something entirely different, not just a murderer, but a man too far gone to even hate. One inmate later said, "He wasn't one of us. He was like a broken child who never came back." Despite his clear psychosis, Chase remained in general death row population at San Quentin Prison, and he didn't stay in a psychiatric unit. While psychiatrists continued to visit him regularly and he was prescribed antipsychotic medications, him taking his medicine was extremely inconsistent. Chase sometimes flushed pills down the toilet, and other times he hoarded them. If any of you are not aware, the most important thing about psych medications is to take them consistently. These meds alter your brain chemistry and can have severe side effects if stopping abruptly or taking them intermittently. The fact that he wasn't able to consistently medicate himself just tells you how badly he needed to be under constant psychiatric care and supervision. His prison notebooks, later discovered, contained page after page of rambling confessions, alien symbols, and desperate pleas for more blood. He believed he was dying and that his internal organs were still being dissolved and that, quote, only red medicine could save him now, end quote. He drew diagrams of blood transfusion machines and labeled certain guards as infiltrators because they were the ones preventing him from getting what he needed. He also attempted on multiple occasions to donate his blood to the Red Cross while in prison, believing it was the only way to, quote, purge the cancerous plasma from his system, end quote. At the height of his delusions, in December 1980, just weeks before Christmas, Chase's mental state took a sharp and sudden turn. He stopped speaking altogether for several days and refused all food. Guards noticed that he had become unusually quiet, not calmer, but more vacant, as if the light inside him had just dimmed. They didn't realize it yet, but Richard Chase was preparing for something irreversible. Over several months, Chase had slowly been hoarding his medication, a powerful antidepressant known as Sinequin, or also known as Doxepin. Prison staff had not tracked the ingestion of the pills closely enough, and Chase had learned how to palm them, hiding them in the folds of his clothing or under his mattress. This is why, once again, he needed constant supervision and psychiatric care. On December 26, 1980, just one day after Christmas, Chase was found lying face up on his cot during morning rounds. He looked peaceful with no signs of struggle and no blood, also no weapons. Just a still body laying in his cell. At first, guards thought, oh wow, he must still be asleep. But when they opened up the cell further, it became clear that Richard was dead. An emergency response was called and CPR was attempted, but he had been dead for hours. As you know from prior cases, every second matters when it comes to response times, so there was no way to save his life at this point. The prison coroner confirmed the cause of death, which was acute drug toxicity. Chase had ingested enough Sinequin to kill an elephant, roughly 36 times the normal dose. The pills had been built up in his system over time, accumulating until one final massive ingestion, and it shut down his nervous system as he slept. He had taken himself out. Chase did not leave a note, and he never told anyone about his plan. The state of California, which had sentenced him to death by gas chamber, would never carry out that execution. News of Chase's death spread quickly through the media, and the reactions were mixed. Victims' families expressed bittersweet relief, although some had hoped to see justice carried through via execution, not this way. Others were simply glad that he wouldn't hurt anyone ever again. Prison staff expressed frustration that he had been able to stockpile pills in the first place. An internal investigation was launched, but no major procedural changes were made, and I don't understand why. Mental health advocates cited that his death was a tragic example of neglect, arguing that a man as psychotic as Chase should never have been in death row to begin with. But the truth was simpler and more dark. Chase didn't kill himself to escape punishment. He killed himself because in his mind, his blood had run out and he had no way to cleanse or obtain more blood. Beyond the gore and headlines, though, Richard Chase's case forced uncomfortable questions into the public spotlight. How did this happen? Chase had been institutionalized multiple times and was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was known to be violent, delusional, and dangerous to both himself and others, and yet he was released from state psychiatric care. His mother chose to take him off antipsychotic medications, and there was no community monitoring or resources in place for him. The consequences of this were 6 brutal murders, including a pregnant woman and 2 children. Then he was sentenced to death row and was able to hoard medication and take his own life somehow? After Chase's case, California began to reevaluate conservatorship laws, particularly around mentally ill individuals who reject medication. The grief endured by the victims' families was unimaginable, made even worse by the graphic nature of the crimes and the way that they were reported. After Chase's case, California began to reevaluate conservatorship laws, particularly around mentally ill individuals who reject medication. Psychiatrists testified before legislative committees urging stronger systems for involuntary outpatient commitment, which are laws that would allow judges to mandate treatment for people with severe psychosis, even after release. The grief endured by the victims' families was unimaginable, made even worse by the graphic nature of the crimes and the way that they were reported. Though most details were redacted in mainstream media, word spread quickly about the cannibalism, necrophilia, and organ removal. The trauma was compounded for those who knew the victims in real life, and my heart just breaks for them. I couldn't imagine seeing daily reminders of this shortly after it happening. The Griffin family, who had lost Ambrose to a seemingly random shooting, struggled to understand how a man could kill without any reason. His sons, both teenagers at the time, never returned to live in Sacramento again after this because their lives were forever changed there. David Wallen, Teresa's husband, became a recluse after her murder. He declined all media interviews, and friends later said he never emotionally recovered from this, especially after learning that Teresa was pregnant at the time of her death. The Marath family was shattered, and Evelyn's parents became vocal advocates for stronger mental health reforms. Jason, the 6-year-old little boy murdered in his bedroom, was memorialized with a small plaque in his elementary school. The Ferreras, whose 22-month-old son David was abducted and mutilated, sued the state for failing to protect them. They also refused all interviews because they were so traumatized. At David's funeral, the small white coffin was carried by a single pallbearer, a heartbreaking symbol of his precious little life taken far too soon. It was not just 6 lives that were stolen through the course of Richard Chase's reign of terror. It was countless. These families were never the same. They are never the same. The community created a fund for victims' families, and over $50,000 at that time was raised in just a few weeks. Churches hosted memorial services and support groups, and they did everything that they could to support these families. A bench was dedicated to Ambrose Griffin, and it sits near the community park where he often used to walk. A scholarship in Teresa Wallen's name was offered through her former high school, and Evelyn Marath and her children are remembered through a family endowment made anonymously in the 1990s to a mental health research foundation, which I think that's very big of them. Their names may no longer be in the headlines, but in Sacramento, their memory remains deeply respected and remembered. The story of Richard Trenton Chase is not just the story of a murderer. It's not even just the story of 6 victims and a city gripped in fear. It's a story about failure, the failure of a system to recognize and prevent danger, and failure to protect all of the victims and their families from a very preventable crime. Because Chase didn't become a killer overnight. His decline was visible, predictable, and preventable. It's easy to think of Chase just as a monster. His acts were monstrous. Drinking blood, cannibalizing people, mutilating corpses, and destroying families. The urge to see him as pure evil is beyond understandable. But Chase wasn't a calculated sociopath or sadistic torturer. He didn't kill for fun, and he didn't kill for fame. He wasn't trying to taunt police or achieve immortality in the headlines. Richard Chase killed because his mind was irrevocably broken. He believed in the deepest and most sincere parts of himself that he was dying and that human blood was his only salvation. Knowing this does not absolve him from guilt. It doesn't lessen the horror, but it does complicate it. The system let him go again and again and again. There's no guarantee that Richard Chase could have ever been saved, but his victims could have been. Had the system acted, had the laws been different, had someone kept him in care, 6 lives might have been spared. He was not a natural-born killer. He became one, with every misdiagnosis, every hospital discharge, and every door left unlocked. Richard Trenton Chase died a forgotten man in a locked cell, far from the chaos that he created. People still lock their doors, whisper warnings to their children, and remember the winter when evil walked the streets looking for open doors. For the victims, Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn and Jason Maroth, Dan Meredith, and little baby David Ferreira, we say their names not to remember how they died, but to remember how much was lost. I pray that they are all resting peacefully and that we continue to tell their story to prevent senseless tragedies like this from ever happening again. Thank you so much, Oreo Skittles, great name by the way, for today's case recommendation. And thank you all from the very bottom of my heart for spending time with me today. Please don't forget to comment cases that you want me to check out, and I will be happy to do so. And drop a blue butterfly as our secret handshake down below if you made it to the very end of the video. Please be sure to take extra good care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders. See you next week, guys. Bye.